Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us for our 73rd edition of Cassandra Lunch. Today we have a last-minute fill-in for our topic, so special thanks to Ryan for stepping up and presenting on an overview and comparison of Datastax dependencies for Cassandra, Spark, and Graph. The co-organizers and organizer for this event are Rahul Singh, Arpin Patel, and myself, and we are always looking for speakers, members, and sponsors. So definitely spread the word about this meetup. We're always looking to grow the community. If you or someone you know is knowledgeable about Cassandra and has some stuff they would like to share, that'd be great. You can reach out to one of us. Our emails are listed below, as well as sponsors. If you want to get plugged here, kind of a shout out for your company, as well as just supporting the community, definitely reach out as well. Data Community DC, we are a part of a larger community, Data Community DC, and we do have an inclusive culture here that we encourage and support all people, regardless of race, religion, sexual orientation. Everyone's welcome here, and we expect respect to be given to those protected classes. You can find out more about Data Community DC at their blog, as well as any other upcoming events related to the Data Community DC organization. What we cover here is everything related to Cassandra. So this could include Datastax Enterprise, the ecosystem surrounding Cassandra, Spark, Kafka, all topics Cassandra are what we aim to share here. This is a point in the introduction where if anyone is new, we like them to share. I'm seeing, doesn't look like anyone's new, so we'll move on. Group rules, if you have a question, please ask it, be polite and courteous to others, and share what you know. It is meant to be a discussion. Here at Anant, we deal with Cassandra and real-time data platforms all the time. It's our specialty. So something we're very familiar with and happy to contribute to the community with these discussions. Datastax is also a partner. We've done some kind of co-hosted events together, and they're always really supportive, as well as George Washington University and some of the other program sponsors and organizational sponsors to Data Community DC. 15-second announcements. I don't think we'll need any today. Other than our usual announcement, Anant is always hiring full or part-time positions for data platform operators, engineers, and architects. Visit careers.anant.us to learn more or share your information, and we can start that process. Some upcoming Cassandra events. Datastax has their weekly workshops. We also have our sister lunch, Data Engineers Lunch, every Monday, same time. Different Zoom link, but same time. Some upcoming topics. We have Apache Livy for our next Data Engineers Lunch. And in our next Cassandra Lunch, we have a guest speaker, Peter Corliss, and he'll be presenting on ScyllaDB and how it kind of differs from Cassandra and what it's good for. You can find all of our events listed at anant.us/events. And all of these videos are recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel. So definitely go check out our playlist there for Cassandra Lunch. There's also one for Data Engineers Lunch. We've talked about, again, I think this is our 70th something Cassandra Lunch. So there's a lot of content there, a lot of information. So definitely, if you visit, don't forget to drop a like and subscribe. And including this discussion will be uploaded there later today. Cassandra.Link should be your #1 resource for all things Cassandra. These are hand-curated articles, blog posts, what have you, and they surround all of the Cassandra ecosystem. Also, if you're looking to learn something specific about Cassandra, definitely go check out Cassandra.Link. It should be the first place you go if you have a question, because I can almost guarantee you that there's going to be some useful articles for whatever it is you have questions about there. And with that, I will pass the screen off to Ryan and let him start his presentation.
Cool, thanks, Josh. Okay, let me just share my scroll. Okay, before I share my screen, so just to introduce what I'm talking about today. So yeah, as Josh mentioned, I recently wrote a blog post about an overview and comparison of Datastax dependencies. And you might be asking yourself, why is this needed? What's the point? I think my experience as I was working on a project is each individual dependency that Datastax has put out, and Datastax has put out a lot of dependencies that are very helpful and fill a lot of use cases. But as I was going through, and each individual library is helpful and has a good amount of documentation, but then sometimes the libraries, they overlap, or they include the same Java classes, or they have similar functionality, but it's a little bit different. And there wasn't, when I was looking, there wasn't a single place to find how to compare all of them together. Okay, a simple use case, for example, if let's say you're working on a Java project, and you need to write to Cassandra, and let's say you also have Graph as part of the project. Okay, well, you use the Java driver, and you make sure you import those classes. You're done. But then let's say maybe a couple months later, you are told, okay, hey, by the way, we want to start writing to Spark. Your Java, your jar is doing great. Your Java code's doing great, but we want to dream bigger. Let's get into Spark. And you're like, okay, what do I do? And you might look, you say, oh, maybe I should just add, I've already got my Java driver in there. I'll just add Spark dependencies on top. Well, or maybe if it's an external Spark, I'll add Byos, or, and you kind of have to start thinking, oh, how does this work? And what you might be surprised to find out is, okay, the old Java driver and the new dependency you just added, they actually have overlapping classes. And it can get more confusing the more complex your use case is. You're using external Spark, what kind of graph operations you're running, and so on and so forth. So that was the general idea. That's the general motivation. And again, I'm coming to this as a learner. So yeah, again, as Josh mentioned, any feedback is just from you guys as your own experience as you've worked with Cassandra, especially on the JVM. Yeah, feel free, just share questions, comments, and that'd be helpful for. I know I'd learn a lot and benefit from that. From any participation you guys have. So let me share my screen. I pulled up the blog post here. I'll send this in the chat too. Okay, here we go. I'll just post the link. And yeah, what is this? So I just wrote the blog post, and I'm not going to read it for you. I'll spare you that. But just to say, this is what I'm talking about here in the presentation is covered in a little bit more depth in the blog post. And the idea is, yeah, just to kind of go through, and hopefully it's helpful for you to kind of get a big picture of, okay, depending on what my use case is, I know exactly where to go, what dependency to use, what documentation I even want to look at, even in for what version, right? For my project. So yeah, I'll just kind of give a high level overview. If there's something that is particularly interesting for anyone, I can slow down and get in more detail as well. So yeah, starting point is just the Java drivers. This is kind of, your basic functionality. When you're using Java to write to Cassandra, this is where you go, the Java drivers. And originally, and this part is a little bit confusing if you're not familiar with this already, but originally there were two sets of Java drivers that Datastax put out. One was the Dse Java driver, and one was the open source Java driver for Cassandra. Both wrote to Cassandra, but Dse Java driver was for writing Cassandra if you're using Datastax Enterprise, and then the open source version was for using open source Cassandra. Both were put out by Datastax, but they had different names. Sometimes that will be confusing. You might be reading a blog post and it mentions Dse Java driver, and you see DS and you think, oh, that's just the Java driver that Datastax put out, but it's for open source. Okay, be careful there. Previously, these were two separate Java drivers. So just to clarify that point, they were two separate Java drivers. If you see Dse Java driver, maybe they'll say something a little bit different, but be careful to clarify and keep in mind, are they talking about the open source Java driver or the Dse Java driver? Okay, so originally there's a Dse Java driver, and this was to use with Datastax Enterprise. However, and this again maybe makes things a little bit more complicated, but in the long run, I think it's a good move. But as of 4.4.0, the unified, they made the open source Java driver unified. So Datastax started to make a move to open up more to the open source community. And so then what they did is instead of having two different sets, they wanted to have a unified Java driver. Whether you're working with Datastax Enterprise or Datastax or just open source Cassandra, you could use the open source Java driver, which we'll cover in a second, to write to Cassandra. And after that, yeah, that's kind of going to be your go-to basic for basic writes to Cassandra, reads from Cassandra. That's the one you would want to use. However, again, it gets a little bit complicated even from just the Java drivers. You might think this means that we can just forget about DSE Java driver. We're moving towards the future. Let's just forget about the past. Unfortunately, even up to the present, the DSE Java driver is still being used and included within other Datastax dependencies. Okay, and we will kind of cover that as we keep moving forward. So yeah, in one sense, it got more simple. There's only one unified Java driver, the unified OSS Java driver. However, there's still some remnant places where you'll see DSE Java driver show up. Okay, just a quick debugging tip. Yeah, code for this library is not open source. There's probably a better way to do this, but I know sometimes I would find when I'm debugging, I would just look over at the equivalent code in the OSS Java driver. And sometimes actually that was helpful to see, oh, okay, here's kind of vaguely what's going on under the DSE Java driver hood. So that's just one tip. Honestly, a better option would be, ask Datastax support, go to Datastax community. But sometimes, if you're into digging into code yourself, that's one option. When do you use this? For the most part, don't. Okay, just use the OSS Java driver unless you're using legacy project or you have a very special use case. I've got my dependency tree here. Here's a small picture. I've got the full one up here on my computer. So yeah, so dependency, if your application jar is a crazy edge case or a legacy project, as far as I know, that's the only use case for when you would end up going for the DSE Java driver. If that is the case, if you do have a crazy edge case and you're using Gremlin queries with Fluent API, you'll use the DSE Java driver graph as well. If not, just DSE Java driver. Okay, that's kind of the dependency tree view. We'll kind of keep referring to this as we keep moving forward. So in general, don't use this, but be aware of it. And as someone that's talking about it, you might hear someone talking about a Java driver, and you got to make sure, are they talking about OSS or a DSE Java driver? And the versions are quite different too, so just be aware of that. It's included in two other Datastax created libraries. One is the Byos jar and the Datastax Enterprise Spark Dependencies. So we'll see that as we continue as well. It doesn't include any of the other dependencies that we talk about in this blog. However, yeah, just keep in mind when you say DSE Java driver, actually there's three different dependencies you might potentially have to add to your POM XML or whatever you do to manage your libs. So yeah, some sample helpful links that I found to be helpful. Yeah, any questions about the DSE Java driver before we continue moving forward? Okay, great. So moving next is the OSS Unified Cassandra Java driver. And again, just to clarify, it wasn't always unified, but as of 4.4.0, it was unified. So this is the one that took over the DSE Java driver's usefulness. Yes, when do you use this? In general, if you're executing Java code, you want to use Java code to access your Cassandra cluster, this is what you're going to want to use, unless you're executing your jar from a Spark cluster. Okay, that's kind of the breaking point in the decision tree. So your Java app is executed on Spark? No, use the OSS Unified Java driver. Okay, so this is going to cover a lot of your use cases. Keep in mind, if you end up using the OSS Spark Cassandra connector, at least to me, it wasn't intuitive, but the OSS Spark Cassandra connector actually includes the OSS Unified Java driver within it. And this point, yeah, it's not always super clear from the documentation. Just So I wanted to note that. Yeah, and here's some helpful links for that as well. Okay, any questions about those two, the OSS Java driver, DSE Java driver?
Do we know what the DSE driver actually does that helps connect to Spark clusters? Like what's different about them that makes one more suitable to use with Spark than the other?
Okay. So yeah, that's a good question. Let me clarify that. So the only time you're going to use the DSE Java driver is if you're not using Spark and you're a legacy project and you're a crazy edge case. If you are using Spark, you're actually going to be using something else. So again, maybe I need to redraw this or make it easier to understand exactly. But if you're using Spark, you still don't use the DSE Java driver. You would normally use Dse Spark dependencies, or if it's an external Spark, use Byos. And as we'll see in a second, actually these two include the DSE Java driver inside of it. So for example, in the introduction, I mentioned let's say you've got a Java project and you're executing batch jobs, just small batch jobs. You don't need Spark. You're just executing your Java code to get stuff into Cassandra. Okay, that works well. Maybe you'll use the DSE Java driver. Let's say a couple months later, your boss says, "Hey, let's use Spark," and you're like, "Okay, great." You want it? It's an internal Spark. You slap on Dse Spark dependencies. You got to be careful because now actually, because Dse Spark dependencies includes the DSE Java driver, you've got your DSE Java driver in there twice. And unless you know exactly what version, so it's better just to remove it. So just to say, yeah, DSE Java driver does not actually write to Spark. For that, you would need a different library. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Obi. Yeah, so in general, don't do that. Okay, so moving on. So let's start. Oh, I think I missed something. Oh yeah, okay, here we go. One more thing to note before moving on from the Java drivers. There is a library called Dse Java Driver Graph. In its most part, if someone says Dse Java driver, they would count this third one under that umbrella. Okay, it's not technically a separate driver from the Dse Java driver. However, I mention it separately because despite what I just said, responding to Obi's question, for example, it's not actually included in the other libraries as far as I could tell. So for example, in each of these cases, like at the end of the tree, well, let's say you've got an edge case. Well, you still have to ask, do I use Gremlin queries with the Fluent API? If yes, you got to make sure you include the Dse Java driver graph. Let's say you're going to use Dse Spark dependencies. Okay, but you have to ask, are you using the Gremlin queries with the Fluent API? If yes, make sure you include Dse Java driver graph because it's not bundled, as far as I could tell, in Dse Spark dependencies or Byos. So that's something to kind of just watch out for. Again, if you know what's going on, you're familiar with it, maybe it's more intuitive. At least for me though, it was kind of confusing. Oh, when do I use Dse Java driver graph? When do I not? So that was kind of like the key. And again, if I'll just kind of open up the docs. You're reading the docs for Dse Java driver, and you go under the page for Fluent API. That's where this will be mentioned, right? The Dse Java driver graph. And but just to say, yeah, be careful with that. If you do want to use the Fluent API, and the Fluent API is great, you can write stuff like this, which looks just like what you put into the Gremlin console, instead of having to write out the whole thing in a string. And this also makes it easy to chain, right? You can chain if you're familiar with graph, you can build out your traversal, and you can build it out, not just like writing a string and making the string bigger and bigger, but actually, kind of like more dynamically using the Java classes. You could do that with the Fluent API. If you want to do that, make sure you include Dse Java driver graph, even if you're using Dse Spark dependencies, even if you're using Byos. Okay, that's the Dse Java driver graph. Questions about that? Again, that's not the case though if you're using an open source Spark driver. But if you're using the OSS driver, then that's included in the unified version. So, but if you're using, let's refer to this thing again. If you're using Spark, or sorry, if you're, yeah, if you want to just do, like you have a DSE cluster and you've got graph, then you can use this. You can use the OSS Unified Java Driver. But then if you start also using Spark, that's when you have to use the DSE Java Driver graph, if that makes sense. Okay. Yeah. Okay, covered that. Yeah, basically note that this is not included in Byos jar or Dse Spark dependencies. Just saying that over and over again, but keep that in mind. If you're building out your POM file and you're like, what do I add? What do I not add? Okay. It's not, if you have Byos jar and you want to use the Fluent API, use the Dse Java driver graph. Okay. And yes, I did open up the jar to find out what classes they're in to figure out some of this. So yeah, again, I found out some of these things that I had a hard time finding documentation. So just hopefully this is a resource to you. Moving on, OSS Spark Cassandra connector. Okay, so that was the Java driver. That's if mostly those are used if you're not using Spark. If you're using Spark, okay, if you're using Spark, then you're going to use something else. You're probably not going to use the OSS Unified Java driver. You're going to use either Dse Spark Dependencies, Byos, or Spark Cassandra connector. Okay, you're not going to need a Java driver. If you are using Spark, the first one to look at is the open source Spark Cassandra connector. This is not for use with a DSE analytics cluster, and it's also not used to connect your DSE cluster with an external Spark. Okay, so you might think, oh, my Spark cluster is open source Spark. Maybe I'll use open source Spark Cassandra connector. False. Okay, if you have a DSE analytics cluster, you don't use OSS Spark Cassandra connector. Okay, here's a helpful chart that Datastax made comparing OSS Spark Cassandra connector and the Byos jar, which is, we'll talk about that at the end, but that's, just have that there as a reference. It doesn't have Datastax official support. It does not have Cassandra to Spark SQL table mapping generator. It doesn't have Spark configuration generator. It doesn't have Cassandra file system access, and doesn't have Kerberos authentication. But yeah, in general, they did a really good job with this. Yeah, it's well documented, and there's a good amount of support community that you can really tap into and use the open source Spark Cassandra connector. Okay, when do you use it? It's for connecting non-DSE Spark, non-DSE Spark with non-DSE Cassandra. Okay, if you're using a DSE Cassandra cluster, even if you're using open source Spark or some external Spark, you're not going to use this. Okay. Special use case. Okay, and this was something that came up in my project, and that's why I kind of brought it up. But if you're using Spark Cassandra connector with Databricks, so there are certain occasions when you do actually use this. If you have a Datastax enterprise cluster, and it's just it gets a little bit complicated. There's some posts in Datastax community where I was asking about this. Like I referenced this in the blog post, but yeah, just kind of like be careful. There are like really rare edge cases where you do actually might consider using Spark Cassandra connector, but even with your Datastax enterprise Cassandra cluster, but in general you don't. One other note just before moving on: if you are using Databricks, be careful with Guava version stuff. That kind of got me. Databricks has their own runtime, and in their runtime they define Guava 15, I think. It was something less than the 16 version, which is required by the Datastax Java driver. So yeah, just be careful of that. And I just talk about that here. I don't want to bore you with the details because probably you're not that interested, but yeah, it's here if you're interested in the future. So one thing to keep in mind: this library, the open source Spark Cassandra connector, it is actually included in the Byos jar or Dse Spark dependencies. In other words, if you're using Byos or if you're using Dse Spark dependencies, don't add the open source Spark Cassandra connector. Okay, and also note it does include within it the open source Java driver. Okay, I cited Datastax community post on that. Yeah, Okay. Any questions about that? The open source Spark Cassandra connector.
Yeah, so when we say don't add things, are we worrying about jar size or are we like foreseeing actual conflicts?
Yeah, there can be conflicts in general. I mean, these jars aren't enormous. Actually, let me think. Yeah, I don't know if I would just say I'm most concerned about compatibility and accidentally using the wrong class and not knowing which class is coming from. And if you like, again, these things are the OSS Java drivers included within it, but what version? And you'd have to like make sure you keep them both. It's like you don't want to do that. You don't want to have two things, two libraries in your POM file, or yeah, again, whatever you use to manage your classes. You don't want to have two things in there defining the same Java classes, because then you don't know which one it's going to use necessarily. And let's say you bump up the version of one, or you're going to bump up the version of the other. Now you have to maintain two things. You don't want to do that. Just simpler, use the one thing that covers it all, right? And that was the point. And I think that's why Datastax did it this way. In some ways it makes it easier, right? Instead of thinking, oh, I've got to add this and add that and add that, and you're trying to like, you got to have a whole recipe to connect to your Cassandra cluster to say, okay, here's this one thing that will solve this use case. And so in that regard, the way Datastax did it was really smart. In some ways, it makes it more simple. But just, I think, if you've got a project where you started with Java and then you move up to Spark or something like that, you might accidentally have two. So I think that's the rationale for why they included both. Like they included the OSS Java driver inside the Spark Cassandra connector, but it just means you got to be a little bit careful. So yeah, I mean, yeah, unless you have some sort of weird use case where you're worried about your jar size. I mean, not weird use case. There are reasons why you don't like huge jars, but in general, I think the big thing is, and actually, I guess I don't know. Maybe one of you guys know, would it even make a bigger jar size? I'm not sure. Because I'm not sure if it would include both classes in the final jar at the end. So anyway, I don't know. I don't know if it will make the larger jar or not. I guess that'd be kind of an interesting thing to look at. But yeah, in the end, you don't want to do it, right? Just don't do it because you're going to create conflicts. So good question. Any other questions or thoughts? I do reference what OSS Java drivers used. You can find it in the, if you love digging into source code. Here it is. Datastax Java driver 4.12. So if you're on the master branch, if you're in the latest open source Spark Cassandra connector, it's going to be using the open source Datastax Java driver 4.12. Something else to point out. This is also helpful to keep in mind if you're debugging and you're like, what documentation do I look at, right? Let's say you use the open source Spark Cassandra connector in your project, and you're like, okay, now I got to go find, I want to find out how to use the Java driver classes. What documentation do you look at? Well, you can kind of go here and you can say, oh, okay, I need to look at the Datastax documentation for 4.12. So that can be helpful to keep in mind as well. Okay. Next up is DSE graph frames. So DSE graph frames is just, it supports some graph functionality. It's inspired by the Databricks graph frame library, and it's for use with Graph and Spark together. Okay, so if you're using Graph and you're using Spark, you can want to consider using DSE graph frames. And yeah, if you're doing gremlin traversals on your DSE cluster that's got DSE graph and it's got Spark, then this can be helpful. Again, it doesn't have all the functionality that the DSE, that other, like the like they actually document this part well, when to use it, when not to use it. If there's more complex queries involved, it's better to use DSE graph OLAP, at least as of DSE 6.7. Or on the other hand, if you're just using simpler queries, then you can benefit from the optimizations of the DSE graph frames. So it's helpful for a very specific use case. If you got that use case, this is your jar, this is your library. If not, then you have to kind of be careful. If you got more complex queries that you're running, then you might need to use DSE Graph OLAP, or you might again need to use the one I mentioned above, the DSE Java driver graph library. However, and this was kind of an interesting note, I don't know, you guys can give some feedback. Unless I'm mistaken, I think you never need to use this because it's only for DSE graph enabled clusters, which means you'll either be using Byos or you'll be using Dse Spark Dependencies, and they both include it under the hood. So I'd love to be corrected if you figure out anything, but I think in general, I guess I said, I thought of one exception. If you have a DSE graph cluster, but you need to use OSS Spark connector for some reason, and you want to use the graph frame API. Okay, so that's kind of like the very, very, very narrow edge case. But I think unless I'm mistaken, I don't think you actually add this to your, your POM file or Gradle or, whatever you use. So I don't include it in the dependency tree because again, I don't, except for a really, really, really small edge case, I don't actually think you add it to your dependency list. Okay, any questions about DSE graph frames when you use it, what it's helpful for? Okay, great. And again, just be careful of that. It's included in the Byos jar and the Dse Spark Dependencies jar. Okay, next, Byos. So finally, we've arrived at the Byos library. If you've been following up at this point, you notice I've just been talking about Byos the whole time because it seems like it just includes everything. It's like this whole, it's this stew of libraries in this one giant library. If you followed up this point, hopefully you kind of understand where Byos fits. However, at the same time, it does get a little bit crazy even with this. So what is Byos? What's the reason for it? It's short for bring your own Spark. Okay, bring your own lunch or bring your own whatever. It's bring your own Spark. And it's if you're using your own external Spark cluster, for example, Databricks, for example, they mentioned Hortonworks Data Platform, Cloudera, or if you're just using open source Spark. If you're using some external Spark except for Datastax Enterprise Analytics, then this is what Byos is made for. One thing to watch out for, and one of the readers of the blog post actually pointed out this to me, Adam Fortuna, thanks for that. He mentioned watch out for versions, that it's only tested with the Spark version that is integrated with the corresponding Datastax Enterprise release. Okay, so for example, Datastax 6.8. If you look at Datastax 6.8, they mentioned this. They say it's tested against the version of Spark integrated into DSE. So if you look at the DSE 6.8 release notes, you'll see that what kind of Spark is used here. Okay, DSE 6.8 uses Spark 2.4. So the Byos jar that you're going to use for your DSE cluster, if you're using DSE 6.8, that Byos library is only tested against Spark 2.4. Okay, so you're going to want to think about that. Like, let's say, for example, you're using Databricks. Okay, so again, this gets where it gets a little bit crazy. Let's say you're using Databricks. I guess I have it in my history. Let's say you're using Databricks and you've got an existing cluster. Okay, well, good luck with that. But if let's say if you don't, then you can decide, okay, maybe I want to use a really old version. Okay, not really old. I guess actually it's not that old, but it feels really old when you're looking at threes, right? But you'll want to use an older version of Databricks if you want to make sure it's compatible. And again, maybe the Byos jar will work for newer Spark, but maybe not. It's not tested against it. So be careful of that. So Databricks version 6.4, it's using Apache Spark version, where'd I go? Okay, 2.4.5. So your Byos jar should hypothetically work with that. But if you're using Databricks runtime 7.3, then that's using Spark 3.0. It's not tested against that. Byos is not tested against that. So just one thing to keep in mind. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. So that's a helpful thing to just kind of watch out for. Again, if you're on an existing infrastructure and they say make it work, maybe just worth giving a shot anyways, and or just recommend, hey, maybe we need to change our versions, or upgrade something, downgrade something. Hopefully you don't have to downgrade, but yeah, that's something to watch out for. When do you use it? Connecting from external Spark to Datastax Enterprise Cassandra. Okay, you want to do a massive Spark job. You don't want to use Datastax Enterprise analytics, like an analytics data center for whatever reason. Then this is what you would use. Maybe you want to use like the nice notebooks, Databricks for notebooks, or whatever else. Yeah, that's when you use BYOS. Okay, just to make this really clear, when do you use instead of Spark Cassandra connector? If you have external Spark connecting to a DSE Cassandra cluster, use BYOS. Okay, if you have external Spark cluster but open source Cassandra, use Spark Cassandra connector, the open source version. Again, there's edge cases, there's exceptions, but in general, that's what you do. Just as a footnote, the small font. This decision tree, like, don't take it as the final word. Of course, this is just a general hint. Hopefully, it gets you at least for most of your use cases, because there are exceptions. But just keep that in mind. When do you use BYOS instead of Dse Spark Dependencies? If you have Dse Analytics, use Dse Spark Dependencies. If you're using external Spark cluster, use BYOS. Okay, again, it includes Dse graph frames, includes Spark Cassandra connector. I actually don't know what version it uses, so if anyone knows or has some documentation for that, that'd be helpful. But I don't know what version of Spark Cassandra connector it's based on. Dse Java driver, it's included, and it's included what version? It includes the version that ships with a particular version of with the same DSC Java driver that ships with that version of DSC. Okay, so for example, DSC 6.7.7 ships with DSC Java driver 1.7.1. So at least by default, BYOS has under the hood included Dse Java driver 1.7.1. Note that down if you're wondering what docs do I look at, what Datastax docs do I look for if I'm using the BYOS jar, or dependencies, or what other constraints you're looking into when you're debugging. That's what you're going to want to keep in mind. That's also, like, for example, if you want to add, if you're using BYOS with Dse Java driver graph, that's the version of Dse Java driver graph you're going to want to use, right? 1.7.1. At the same time, I did see a note by a maintainer that said that they do plan to upgrade. So I'm not sure where they would announce that. Maybe that's just something you'd want to ask, your Datastax enterprise support team, like, did something change? Or I don't know where you'd find that out. But he did mention in the future they are planning on upgrading the Dse 6.7.7. The Dse Java driver that ships with BYOS for Dse 6.7.7 to 1.8.3 instead of 1.7.1. That was a lot of numbers, but hopefully that makes sense. So by default, at least for right now, the BYOS includes the Dse Java driver that ships with that version of Dse, but they might upgrade in the future. Okay. Some implications of what I've just talked about. If you're using Gremlin traversals and you're using BYOS, you don't need to include Dse graph frames. You don't need to include Spark Cassandra connector. You don't need to include a separate Java driver. You might need to include Dse Java driver graph, but I think that's it, right? And that's if you're using the Fluent API. I think that's it. Okay, any questions about BYOS? Okay, great. And I just include some links there. Dse Spark Dependencies, I've already talked about it a little bit, but this is what you'll find, like, if you go to the Datastax docs for 6.8, and not just 6.8, but if you go to the Dse docs, and you'll see that if you're connecting to Spark and you're actually using DSE analytics, this is what you use, and it's just, it includes everything. So again, in one sense, it makes it simple. Oh, I've got everything all in one spot. Great. Everything, mind you, except for DSE Java Driver Graph. But yeah, I almost have everything that I want in one shot. So that's what you'd include, Dse Spark Dependencies. And this is kind of like, again, either if you're using Datastax, if you're using DSE, DSE Cassandra cluster, either you're going to use Byos or using Dse Spark Dependencies, and then you shouldn't necessarily need to use anything else besides that. Yep, as they mentioned in the blog, it includes some Spark jars, their dependencies, Apache Cassandra jar, Spark Cassandra connector jar, and many others, right? So it's kind of a catch-all thing. Yeah. So again, just beware of that. Don't double include these libraries in your project. Okay. I made a little chart, so hopefully this kind of helps you see what's bundled within what. Again, DSE, Spark Dependencies, and Byos include include a lot of everything else. Spark open source Spark Cassandra connector includes the open source Java driver. So again, just kind of be mindful of those things. Okay, that's kind of the end. Hopefully that helps at least give you the big picture, especially if you're new to Cassandra and you're like, okay, what jar do I use? What library do I use? Hopefully that gives you the kind of a big picture of how each jar fits within the ecosystem and what do you use when, and what, before you go diving into mounds of documentation, like, oh, okay, here's what you're going to want to look for and what and when. So yeah, any final questions or comments, things to share from your own advice or experiences you've had when you're developing on the JVM to connect with your Cassandra cluster?
Yeah, there was something I was curious about, so I just looked it up. The DSE Graph Frames library actually it's compatible with Spark GraphX, so you can use that to do your graph analytics in Spark. Like it'll translate your traversals into data frames, and you can do analytics on those. So there's compatibility there, which I was planning to ask about, but I ended up just looking up.
Oh, cool. Okay, great. Yeah, I guess I'm not familiar with GraphX. I don't know very much about it. You want to share quickly what GraphX is?
Yeah. So if you look for like when you're looking up Spark or something, they generally have it split into like the client, Spark SQL, MLlib. Let me actually look this up because they sort of split it into 5 sections is what I'm trying to say. And one of those is GraphX, which is the Spark library for graph processing. And so I was curious if DSE Graph and and Spark Streaming was the 5th one. So Spark SQL, Spark Streaming, MLlib, GraphX, and then just the normal Spark capability. GraphX is used for graph processing. So I was wondering if the DSE Graph sort of Cassandra graph representation was compatible with the Spark GraphX representation. And it turns out they are through DSE Graph Frames.
Great, cool. Good to know. Thanks for sharing that, Obi. Yeah, and so it seems like you do want to know what, like I mentioned, I don't think you actually want to include it in your libraries, but you do want to use it and think about it and know like, oh, there's a reason why they built it, right? And yeah, it seems like this is one of the reasons is to be able to use GraphX. So cool, thanks for sharing that. Any other thoughts or comments? Well, great. I think that's stop right there then. Josh, anything you wanted to add or say for closing?
Yeah, thank you, Ryan, for the for the presentation. I know getting dependencies right, especially with so many moving parts, can be a tough time, especially if it sounds like the documentation isn't as comprehensive as you would like in the area. So very much appreciate that and creating a resource for the community.
Cool. Thanks, Josh. Yeah, hopefully it saves you some like head pounding in your future projects. So
Yeah,